Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the backbreaking, mud-soaked existence of those who quite literally fed the medieval world, the peasant farmer. You've probably seen them in movies and paintings, happily harvesting golden wheat under sunny skies, singing folk songs while children dance around maypoles in picturesque villages. But trust me, being a real medieval farmer was nothing like those romantic pastoral scenes. It was filthy, exhausting, soul-crushing work that left you one bad harvest away from starvation, and in most cases, it absolutely sucked. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So before you settle in for tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're exploring here together. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the weather's like in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see our community spanning different seasons and time zones. Maybe you're experiencing a gentle spring rain, or perhaps autumn leaves are falling outside your window. Whatever the case, you're about to discover just how much your ancestors would have envied your climate-controlled comfort. Now, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm blanket, and let's settle into tonight's exploration together. Perhaps brew yourself some tea, something our medieval farmer could only dream of affording. Feel the softness of your mattress, the security of knowing tomorrow's meal is guaranteed, because you're about to enter a world where such luxuries didn't exist. Tonight, we're travelling back to the village of Thornwick in the kingdom of Valdres, somewhere in what we might now call Central Europe, during the year 1347. The Black Death hasn't arrived yet, but life is already brutal enough. Here, in this world of endless mud and constant hunger, we'll follow the life of someone born into a destiny they never chose, a destiny that would break their body, drain their spirit, and tie them to the land like a chain around their ankle. You're about to discover what it truly meant to wake before dawn every single day of your life, not because you wanted to catch a sunrise, but because the Lord's fields demanded it. You'll learn what it felt like to watch your children go to bed hungry, because the harvest belonged to someone else. You'll experience the terror of watching storm clouds gather, knowing they could destroy not just your crops, but your family's survival for the next year. This isn't a story about the nobility in their stone castles, or the merchants in their comfortable guilds, or even the craftsmen in their workshops. This is about the 90%, the forgotten majority who lived and died in anonymity, whose names were never written in chronicles, whose graves were never marked with stone. These were the people who grew the grain that fed the knights, who raised the livestock that filled the Lord's table, who built the very foundation of medieval society with their calloused hands and bent backs. You'll witness what it meant to live in a world where a bad storm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Where sickness didn't mean a few days off work, it meant watching your family face starvation because there was no one else to work the fields. Where winter wasn't a season of cosy fires and warm meals, it was a months-long battle against cold, hunger, and despair. We'll explore how it felt to be bound to the land not by choice, but by law. How it felt to work from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, only to hand over most of what you produced to a lord who never touched a plough himself. You'll understand what it meant to live in a world where a single cow represented your family's entire fortune, where losing a chicken could mean your children wouldn't eat meat for months. This is the story of life at the very bottom of the medieval hierarchy, below the knights, below the clergy, below the merchants, below almost everyone. Yet paradoxically, it's also the story of the people who made everything else possible. Without them, there would have been no stone cathedrals, no shining armour, no grand feasts. The entire medieval world rested on their shoulders, and those shoulders were always aching. You'll discover what it was like to live in a house that was little more than a single room shared with your animals, where privacy didn't exist and comfort was a foreign concept. You'll learn about the constant battle against nature, not just the weather, but the insects, the diseases that could wipe out your crops, the wild animals that could destroy your livelihood in a single night. But perhaps most importantly, you'll understand the psychological weight of knowing that this was your life forever. There was no career change, no retirement, no escape. You were born a farmer, you would die a farmer, and your children would be farmers too. The horizon of possibility never extended beyond the next harvest, the next season, the next year if you were lucky. So take a deep breath of your climate-controlled air. Feel the softness of your furniture and prepare to step into a world where such comfort was unimaginable. Tonight, you're not just learning history, you're experiencing what it truly meant to be human in an age when humanity itself was a struggle for survival. The rain is beginning to fall on the thatched roof of a small hut in Thornwick, and somewhere in the darkness, a baby is crying. That baby is you, and your story is about to begin. Welcome to the life of medieval farmer, where every day was a battle, and survival itself was an act of heroism. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. You were born into the muddy, unforgiving world of Thornwick on a cold October night in 1347, when the wind howled through the gaps in your family's wattle and daub walls like a hungry ghost. No midwife attended your birth, just your father's calloused hands and your mother's exhausted prayers to St. Bridget, patron of farmers and livestock. Your first breath was thick with the smell of damp straw, animal dung, and the smoky peat fire that barely warmed the single room your entire family called home. There was no celebration of your arrival, no feast, no gifts. Your birth was simply another mouth to feed in a world where food was always scarce. Your father, Godwin the ploughman, looked down at you with eyes worn hollow by 34 years of backbreaking labour, and all he could think was whether you'd live long enough to help with the spring planting. In medieval Valdres, infant mortality wasn't a statistic. It was a constant shadow hanging over every cradle. You weren't born free. You were born a villain, bound to Lord Aldrich's manor like a piece of property. The land your family worked didn't belong to them. It belonged to the manor, and by extension to you. Your grandfather had been a villain, your father was a villain, and now you were destined to be one too. This wasn't a choice or a career path. It was a legal binding as permanent as the iron shackles worn by criminals. Your family's destiny was written in the Domesday records of Thornwick Manor, where your name would eventually be scratched in Latin next to your father's, Godwin Arator et Filius Aegis, Godwin the ploughman and his son. You owned nothing, not even yourself. You couldn't leave the village without Lord Aldrich's permission. You couldn't marry without his consent. You couldn't even learn to read without risking punishment for stepping above your station. The hut you were born in was built by your grandfather's hands, from whatever materials the forest provided and the Lord allowed. Mud, sticks, stones, and hope. The walls were barely shoulder high, and the roof was a patchwork of thatch that leaked when it rained and harboured rats year-round. The floor was nothing but packed earth, swept clean each morning and muddy again by noon. This wasn't poverty by choice. This was the life that medieval society had designed for people like you. Your inheritance wasn't gold or land or title. It was a wooden plough older than your father, a handful of farming tools with handles worn smooth by generations of desperate hands, and a small plot of land that your family could work for themselves, if they finished working the Lord's land first. The plot was maybe 2 acres, scattered in strips across different fields according to the ancient rotation system that governed all agricultural life in Valdres. But even that meagre inheritance came with strings attached. When your father died, Lord Aldrich would claim the best cow, the finest tool, or whatever else caught his eye as a death tax called heriot. Your family would have to buy back the right to keep working their own strips of land by paying a fee called relief. If they couldn't pay, another family would take their place, and yours would be cast out to beg on the roads. Your mother Edith had already buried 3 children before you were born. Their tiny graves were marked only by rough stones in the village churchyard, where Father Benedict said their souls had returned to God before they could be corrupted by earthly sin. She looked at you with the guarded love of a woman who had learned not to become too attached too quickly. In her world, hope was a luxury that could break your heart. The night you were born, snow began to fall early, which the village elders took as an omen. Old Thurston, who remembered the terrible famine of 1315, shook his head and muttered that children born in hard winters were either blessed with unusual strength or cursed to lives of unusual suffering. Your parents prayed for the former, but prepared for the latter. There were no books in your household, no decorations, no windows made of glass. Light came from rush candles dipped in animal fat, and even those were saved for the darkest winter nights. Most evenings your family worked and talked by the glow of the central fire, which served for cooking, warmth, and illumination. The smoke stung your eyes from your first days, teaching you early that comfort and convenience were foreign concepts. Your cradle was a wooden box your father had carved from an oak branch during the previous winter, when outdoor work was impossible. It was simple, functional, and built to last through multiple children, assuming any survived. Your first blanket was woven from wool your mother had spun herself from the family's two sheep, Brunhild and Giselle, who shared the hut with you and provided warmth during the coldest nights. This was your birthright, a life of labour, bound to land you'd never own, in service to a lord you'd rarely see, under a system that offered no escape and little hope. You were born to work until your body failed, to produce food you'd never eat enough of, and to raise children for the same fate. But you were also born into something else, a community of people who understood survival, who knew that life was hard but still found ways to laugh, to love, and to endure. In the hardest of worlds, they had created small pockets of humanity that would sustain you through the darkness ahead. The rain continued to fall on the thatch above, and somewhere in the village the church bell tolled midnight. Your life as a medieval farmer had officially begun. If you thought childhood meant playing with carved wooden toys or learning your letters by a warm hearth, you were born into the wrong century. By the time you could walk without stumbling into the cooking fire, your real education had already begun, and that education had nothing to do with books, songs, or stories. It was about survival, submission, and the brutal realities of life at the bottom of the feudal ladder. Your first clear memory isn't of your mother's lullabies or your father's gentle words. It's of being dragged from your straw mattress before dawn, when the world was still black and the air bit your lungs like tiny knives. You were maybe 4 years old, small enough that the wooden bucket you carried was almost as tall as you were, but old enough to understand that when father said come, you came. No questions, no delays, no protests. Your initiation into the farming life began with the animals, not because they were gentle or child-friendly, but because even a small child could scatter grain for the chickens or chase the geese back toward the pen when they wandered too far. The family's livestock weren't pets. They were walking investments, each one representing months of careful saving and planning. Losing a chicken to a fox meant your family might not taste meat again until the next slaughter season. The first rule you learned was simple. The animals ate before you did. Every morning, while your stomach cramped with hunger and your mother rationed out thin porridge made from yesterday's bread, you watched your father measure grain for the chickens, hay for the ox, and kitchen scraps for the pig with the precision of an alchemist. These creatures would provide eggs, milk, meat, and labour. You were just another mouth to feed until you proved your worth. Old Henrik, the village reeve who managed the day-to-day operations of Lord Aldrich's estate, became your first real teacher outside the family. Henrik was a hard man, weathered by 50 years of mediating between the Lord's demands and the villagers' capabilities. He had survived 3 famines, 2 plagues, and countless bad harvests by knowing exactly how much pressure to apply and when. To him, you weren't a child, you were a future labourer who needed proper training. Henrik taught you to read the sky before you could read words. See how the clouds gather thick on the western horizon, he'd say, pointing with one gnarled finger toward the darkening afternoon. Rain before vespers. Get the hay under cover or watch it rot. Weather wasn't conversation. It was prophecy that could mean the difference between life and death. A sudden hailstorm could destroy months of work in minutes. An unexpected frost could kill seedlings that represented your family's entire hope for survival. You learned to count, not with numbers written on parchment, but with grain seeds, sheep, and days until harvest. 47 days until we reap the barley, Henrik would mutter, marking another notch on his counting stick. 13 sheep in the common pasture, but watch for wolves when the moon's dark. Mathematics wasn't abstract, it was the difference between prosperity and starvation, measured in very concrete, very perishable terms. The church played its role in your education too, though not in the way you might expect. Father Benedict, the village priest, was a political appointment more than a spiritual guide. He served Lord Aldrich's interests first, God's second, and the villagers last. Every Sunday he reminded the congregation that their earthly sufferings were tests of faith, that obedience to their betters was obedience to God, and that questioning the natural order was tantamount to heresy. You learned the church calendar not because it connected you to divine mysteries, but because it governed your entire working life. Feast days meant no work in the fields, which sounded like relief until you realised that lost work days meant longer hours later to make up for lost time. Holy days came with their own obligations. tithes to be paid, services to attend, and additional labour for church maintenance that nobody could refuse. The most important lesson came from watching your parents navigate the complex web of obligations that bound your family to the manor. Every week, your father owed 3 days of labour on Lord Aldrich's domain lands, the choice fields closest to the manor house. Those 3 days weren't suggestions or requests. They were legal obligations backed by the threat of punishment, exile, or worse. You watched your father bite his tongue when Henrik assigned him to muck out the Lord's stables instead of tending to your family's ripening grain. You saw your mother's jaw clench when the manor demanded her best eggs for Lord Aldrich's table, while her own children went without. You learned that fairness was a luxury for those who could afford it, and justice was whatever served the Lord's interests. The other village children weren't playmates. They were fellow conscripts in this system of hereditary bondage. Little Margot, whose father tended the Lord's vineyard, already knew which grapes would ripen when and how to prune vines without damaging next year's growth. Young Willem could identify foot rot in sheep from 20 paces and knew which herbs might cure it. These weren't games or hobbies. They were survival skills, passed down like family heirlooms but far more valuable. By age 5, you understood that the world was divided into 2 types of people: those who owned the land and those who worked it. The owners lived in stone houses with glass windows, wore clothes that weren't patched, and ate meat whenever they wanted. The workers lived in huts, wore whatever cloth they could weave or afford, and dreamed of meat on feast days. You also learned about the violence that lurked beneath the surface of medieval life. When Cerdic the shepherd tried to sell grain from his family plot at the market without permission, Henrik had him tied to the village pillory for 3 days. When young Aldwin was caught hunting rabbits in the Lord's forest, he lost 2 fingers to the manor's justice. When Godiva the widow couldn't pay her rent after her husband died, her family was evicted and forced to beg on the roads. These weren't cautionary tales told to frighten children. They were recent events, visible reminders of what happened to those who forgot their place in the order of things. You learned to keep your eyes down when Henrik passed, to never question an order from your betters, and to accept that your life belonged not to you, but to forces you couldn't control or understand. The most chilling lesson came during your 6th winter, when the harvest had been poor and the village faced real hunger. You watched families make impossible choices, sell their ox, and lose the ability to plough next year's fields, or keep the ox and watch their children grow weak from malnutrition. You saw neighbours who had shared tools and labour for generations suddenly become competitors for limited resources. This was your education, a curriculum of submission, survival and sacrifice. By the time you reached 7 years old, you had learned more about the brutal realities of life than most modern people learn in a lifetime, and your real training hadn't even begun yet. By your 7th birthday, the gentle introduction to farm life was over. The real training began, and it started with your hands wrapped around the handle of a hoe that was taller than you were. Your father didn't ease you into the work. He threw you into it like a stone into deep water, expecting you to sink or swim on your own merit. Swimming, in this case, meant learning to swing that heavy iron blade into the earth from dawn until your arms screamed for mercy. The first skill they taught you was weeding, which sounds simple until you realise that every mistake could cost your family their survival. Miss a patch of thistles among the barley, and they'd spread like a plague, choking out the grain your family needed to pay their rent and fill their bellies. Pull up a young wheat shoot instead of a weed, and you'd just destroyed part of next winter's bread supply. Your father watched you work with the intensity of a hawk, ready to cuff your ear if your attention wandered for even a moment. "See this?" he'd say, grabbing your small hand and forcing your fingers to touch the serrated edge of a young nettle. "This will steal the strength from the oats, but this," he'd guide your hand to a similar-looking plant, "this is wild garlic. Pull the nettle, leave the garlic, get it wrong, and we all pay the price." The lessons were always accompanied by consequences, always reinforced by fear. Because in medieval farming, ignorance wasn't just costly, it was potentially fatal. Your back learned to curve into the shape of agricultural labour. Hour after hour you bent over rows of crops, your spine developing the permanent arch that marked every farmer in Thornwick. The village children didn't stand straight and tall like the Lord's sons. They grew curved, their bodies moulded by the demands of constant labour. By age 8, you could already feel the ache settling into your lower back, a dull throb that would become your constant companion for the rest of your life. The plough became your greatest challenge and your harshest teacher. Your father's ancient wooden plough, reinforced with strips of iron that had been hammered and reforged countless times, required the strength of an ox and the skill of a craftsman to operate properly. At first, you were too small to guide it, so your job was to walk behind and clear the stones that the ploughshare unearthed. But stones weren't just obstacles, they were weapons. A rock thrown up by the plough could break bones, split skulls, or blind you permanently. Learning to read the soil took years of mistakes written in scraped knees, pulled muscles and failed crops. Clay soil that looked rich and dark could become hard as stone when it dried, trapping roots and starving plants. Sandy soil that seemed easy to work would let water and nutrients drain away too quickly. Loamy soil was perfect, but rare. Most of your family's strips were a mixture of clay, sand, and stones, requiring different techniques and different timing to yield anything edible. The three-field system that governed all agriculture in Valdris became your calendar, your clock, and your Bible all rolled into one. Each year, one field lay fallow to recover its strength. One field grew spring crops like oats and barley, and one field grew winter crops like wheat and rye. But within that simple system lay 1,000 complexities that could destroy an entire season's work if you got them wrong. Timing was everything, and timing was taught through exhaustion and repetition. Plant the barley too early and late frost would kill the shoots. Plant it too late, and summer drought would stunt the growth. The margin for error was measured in days, sometimes hours. You learned to feel the soil temperature with your bare hands, to judge moisture by squeezing earth between your fingers, to predict weather by watching the behavior of birds and insects. Your hands transformed from soft child's flesh into tools designed for gripping, pulling, and striking. Calluses formed in layers, like armor made of dead skin. Blisters rose and burst and rose again until your palms developed permanent ridges where the hoe handle rested. Your fingers grew thick and stubby from years of gripping rough wood and sharp metal. By age 10, you could barely feel a splinter piercing your skin, and burns from hot metal tools registered as mild discomfort rather than agony. The seasonal rhythms became your heartbeat. Spring meant ploughing, planting, and praying that the seeds would sprout before the birds ate them or the rains washed them away. Summer meant weeding, watering, and watching for the insects, diseases, and weather that could destroy months of labour in a single day. Autumn meant harvest, the most critical and dangerous time of the year, when everything your family had worked for hung in the balance. Harvest season was a race against time, weather, and exhaustion. The grain had to be cut at exactly the right moment. Too early and it wouldn't store properly. Too late and it would shatter and fall to the ground. You learned to swing a sickle until your shoulders burned, to gather sheaves until your back refused to straighten, to thresh grain until your arms felt like they would fall off. And all of this work had to be completed while the weather held, because rain could ruin the entire year's crop in hours. Winter brought different lessons, equally harsh, but taught indoors. You learned to repair tools with whatever materials you could find or make. Broken handles were whittled from green wood and fitted carefully to preserve precious metal blades. Torn harnesses were stitched with sinew, reinforced with strips of leather cut from worn-out shoes. Nothing could be wasted, nothing could be replaced easily, so everything had to be maintained with obsessive care. The mathematical precision required for medieval farming would have impressed a scholar, if any scholars had bothered to notice. You learned to calculate how many acres one ox could plough in a day, how much seed was needed per furlong, how much grain to save for next year's planting versus how much your family could afford to eat. Get these calculations wrong, and your family faced starvation or the humiliation of begging seed grain from neighbours who had little to spare. Disease recognition became another vital skill, taught through bitter experience. Black rot on wheat, rust on barley, blight on rye. Each had its own symptoms, its own timeline, and its own devastating consequences. You learned to spot the early signs of crop disease the way a physician learned to diagnose plague, because catching it early might save part of the harvest, while missing it could mean total loss. Your education in medieval farming was measured not in years completed or skills mastered, but in survival. Each season you lived through, each harvest you helped complete, each winter your family survived. These were your diplomas, written in scar tissue and aching joints. By your 10th birthday, You had learned more about the practical sciences of agriculture than most university-trained scholars knew about their dusty books. And yet, for all your hard-won knowledge and prematurely aged body, you were still just beginning. The real test wasn't learning the skills, it was learning to endure them for a lifetime. By your 12th year, something fundamental shifted inside you. The farm stopped being a place where you worked and became the entire universe where you existed. You no longer went to the fields, you belonged to them. The rhythm of planting and harvest had synchronized with your heartbeat so completely that you could feel the seasons changing in your bones before the weather showed any signs. You had become less a person who farmed and more a living extension of the land itself. Your internal clock had been completely rewired by the demands of agricultural life. You woke naturally in the deep darkness before dawn, not because anyone roused you, but because your body had learned that missing the first productive hours of daylight was a luxury your family couldn't afford. Sleep became something you rationed like grain during a famine, taking only what was absolutely necessary to function, never what felt comfortable or restorative. The sounds of Thornwick had become your symphony, and you could conduct it with your eyes closed. The creaking of the mill wheel told you the stream was running strong enough for grinding grain. The lowing of cattle in the common pasture warned you that wolves might be prowling the forest edge. The church bells marked not just the hours for prayer, but the precise moments when specific tasks needed to begin or end. When the afternoon bell rang, you knew exactly how much daylight remained for outdoor work. Your relationship with the land had evolved into something almost mystical. You could tell the health of the soil by walking across it barefoot, feeling through your soles whether the earth was too compacted, too dry, or diseased in some subtle way. Your nose had become sensitive enough to detect the faint sweetness that preceded crop blight, the metallic scent that warned of coming hail, or the rich loamy smell that meant the compost was ready for spreading. The tools had become extensions of your body in the most literal sense. Your hands knew the balance point of every hoe, the exact pressure needed to guide the plough without fighting it, the precise angle required to swing a scythe efficiently through standing grain. When Henrik handed you a new tool, your muscles could judge its quality within minutes, whether the handle would hold up to hard use, whether the metal had been properly tempered, whether the weight distribution would cause premature fatigue. Weather prediction had elevated from survival skill to supernatural ability. You could taste rain in the air hours before clouds appeared, feel the pressure changes that preceded storms, and judge wind patterns by watching how smoke rose from the village chimneys. The other farmers had begun to trust your forecasts over the traditional signs because your success rate was uncanny. This wasn't magic. It was total immersion in an environment where weather could mean life or death. Your body had completed its transformation into a farming machine. Your shoulders had broadened to handle heavy loads, but your spine had curved permanently from years of bent-over labour. Your hands were so thickened with calluses that you could grab hot metal without flinching, yet sensitive enough to detect the texture differences that indicated ripe versus unripe grain. Your legs could carry you across uneven fields for hours without fatigue, but they ached constantly from the endless walking, bending, and lifting. The village itself had become an extension of your consciousness. You knew which families were struggling by watching how carefully they rationed their chickens' feed. You could predict personality conflicts before they erupted by observing subtle changes in how neighbours shared tools or labour. The social dynamics of Thornwick weren't entertainment or gossip. They were intelligence that could affect everything from your family's access to help during crisis to your chances of arranging marriages for future siblings. Food had transformed from pleasure to fuel, carefully calculated and never wasted. You could judge the nutritional content of a meal by looking at it, determining whether it provided enough energy for heavy labour, or just enough to keep you functioning. Hunger wasn't discomfort. It was data telling you how much work your body could handle and for how long. You had learned to eat quickly and efficiently, saving time and energy for more productive activities. The economic system of the manor had become as familiar as your own family structure. You knew exactly when Lord Aldrich's steward would arrive to collect rents, which taxes were negotiable and which were absolute, and how to time your family's production to minimise what they owed while maximising what they kept. This wasn't rebellion. It was survival mathematics, practiced by every villain family that lasted more than a generation. Your understanding of the broader world had shrunk to what directly affected agricultural productivity. Wars mattered only if they disrupted trade routes for seed or caused soldiers to requisition grain. Religious festivals were significant only for how they affected the work schedule. Royal politics were relevant only when they changed tax structures or labour obligations. Everything else was noise, distracting from the essential business of growing enough food to survive another year. The seasonal cycles had become your religion, more deeply felt than anything Father Benedict preached from his pulpit. Spring was resurrection, when frozen earth came back to life and offered hope for renewal. Summer was purgatory, a test of endurance under the blazing sun, with everything depending on your ability to work through exhaustion and discomfort. Autumn was Judgment Day, when the year's worth of labour was weighed and measured. Winter was death, cold and dark and full of the constant fear that stored food wouldn't last until spring. Your social identity had merged completely with your economic function. You weren't Godwin's son who happened to farm. You were a farmer who happened to have been born to Godwin. When people saw you, they saw productivity, potential labour, a unit in the agricultural machine that kept the manor functioning. Your worth was measured in bushels of grain, acres ploughed, or days of work completed, not in personal qualities or individual achievements. Even your dreams had been colonised by farming. You no longer dreamed of adventure, romance, or fantasy. You dreamed of perfect harvests, of rain arriving exactly when needed, of tools that never broke, and backs that never ached. Sometimes you had nightmares about crop failures, livestock diseases, or failed harvests, waking with the same anxiety you felt during waking hours. The transformation was complete. You had become what medieval society needed you to become, a human being whose entire existence was optimized for agricultural production. You thought like soil, felt like weather, and moved like a well-maintained tool. The person you might have been in a different time or place had been completely overwritten by the demands of survival in 14th century Thornwick. And strangely, despite everything you had lost in this transformation, there was a kind of peace in it. The constant uncertainty about your purpose, about what you should do with your life, had been eliminated. You knew exactly why you existed, and exactly what was expected of you. In a world full of chaos and unpredictability, that certainty was perhaps the only luxury you possessed. By your 15th year, your body had become a living testament to the brutality of medieval agricultural life. While other young men your age in more fortunate circumstances might be growing tall and straight, filling out with the promise of adulthood, you had been shaped into something entirely different. A human machine designed for one purpose and already showing the wear of constant use. Your spine told the story of 10,000 mornings bent over sprouting crops. What had started as temporary soreness from weeding and harvesting had evolved into a permanent curvature that marked you as clearly as a brand. Your shoulders rolled forward from years of carrying heavy sacks, pulling stubborn oxen, and wielding tools that had been designed for grown men. Standing completely upright had become impossible. Your body simply wouldn't straighten past a certain point, as if the very bones had learned to curve in submission to gravity and labour. Your hands had transformed into something that barely resembled human appendages. The calluses weren't just thick patches of hard skin anymore. They were layers upon layers of protective tissue, built up like geological formations over years of gripping wooden handles, sharp metal edges, and rough rope. Your fingertips were so deadened to sensation that you could pinch out candle flames without feeling heat. Yet somehow they had also developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to texture that allowed you to judge grain quality or soil moisture with a touch. The joints in your fingers moved differently now, swollen and stiff from repetitive motions and minor injuries that had never been allowed to heal properly. Your knuckles were permanently enlarged, giving your hands a gnarled appearance that made them look decades older than your 15 years. Several fingernails had been lost to accidents, with tools or crushing injuries from heavy stones, and the ones that remained were thick, yellowed, and cracked from constant exposure to dirt and harsh weather. Your legs had developed a peculiar combination of strength and damage. The muscles were dense and powerful from years of walking behind ploughs, climbing over uneven terrain, and maintaining balance while working on slopes. But your knees had begun to make disturbing clicking sounds when you bent them, and they swelled noticeably by the end of each working day. The cartilage was wearing away prematurely, ground down by the constant stress of agricultural labour performed by a body that was still growing. Your feet had adapted to their harsh environment in ways that would have horrified anyone accustomed to comfort. The soles were so thickened with calluses that you rarely bothered with shoes during the warmer months, walking across stubble fields and rocky ground with the same ease others might stroll across smooth flagstones. But this adaptation came at a cost. Your feet had spread and flattened under the constant pressure, and several toes had been broken by falling tools or kicking stones, heeling crookedly and leaving you with a slightly uneven gait. Perhaps most disturbing was what had happened to your face and overall appearance. Constant exposure to wind, sun, and harsh weather had aged your skin far beyond your years. Your complexion was permanently darkened and roughened, with deep lines already forming around your eyes from squinting against bright sunlight and blowing dust. Your hair had become coarse and brittle from the same environmental factors, often caked with dirt and chaff that no amount of washing could completely remove. Your teeth, never strong to begin with due to the poor nutrition of your childhood, had begun to show serious wear from the gritty bread that formed the staple of your diet. The flour available to peasant families was often poorly ground, containing fragments of stone from the millstones that gradually wore down tooth enamel. Several of your back teeth had already cracked from this constant abrasion, causing persistent pain that you simply learned to ignore because there was no treatment available. But the most profound changes went deeper than what was visible on the surface. Your bones had developed a density and strength unusual for someone your age, built up by the constant stress of heavy labour. This adaptation was your body's attempt to cope with demands that would have crippled someone not gradually conditioned to them. However, this same stress had also begun to cause microfractures in places where the load was too concentrated, particularly in your spine and the weight-bearing joints of your legs. Your cardiovascular system had adapted as well, developing the kind of endurance that allowed you to work from dawn to dusk without collapsing. Your heart had grown stronger, and your lung capacity had increased to cope with the demands of sustained physical labour. But this adaptation had been achieved at a terrible cost. Your resting heart rate was higher than it should have been, your blood pressure was already showing signs of elevation, and you had developed a persistent cough from years of breathing dust, chaff, and other agricultural particles. The digestive system that had once processed your mother's milk and simple porridge now struggled with the coarse, often contaminated food that formed your adult diet. Intestinal parasites were a constant problem, causing chronic pain and malnutrition that further weakened your overall constitution. Your stomach had learned to function despite irregular meals and poor quality food, but the constant stress had begun to cause ulceration and other internal damage. Most alarming of all was the realization that your body was already beginning to fail in ways that should have been decades in the future. At 15, you moved like a man of 30. Your reflexes had slowed, your flexibility was severely limited, and recovery from injuries took much longer than it should have. Simple cuts that should have healed in days became infected and festered for weeks. Bruises lingered for months, and muscle strains that once resolved in days now persisted for seasons. The comparison to your contemporaries in other social classes was stark and depressing. When Lord Aldrich's son visited the village on hunting expeditions, the difference was impossible to ignore. He was tall, straight-backed, clear-skinned, and moved with the easy grace of someone whose body had never been forced to adapt to brutal physical demands. His hands were soft, his teeth were white and straight, and his bearing suggested a future full of possibility rather than predetermined decline. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of your physical transformation was how completely normal it seemed to everyone around you. Your parents looked at your prematurely aged body and saw not a tragedy, but a successful adaptation to the life they had known. Henrik the Reeve examined your work capacity and saw not a young man being consumed by labour, but a valuable asset reaching peak productivity. Father Benedict preached that physical suffering was a pathway to spiritual salvation, transforming your obvious pain into a religious virtue. Even you had learned to see your deteriorating body as simply the natural cost of survival. The constant aches, the limited mobility, the premature aging, these weren't problems to be solved, but realities to be endured. You had never known any other way of being, so the gradual destruction of your physical health seemed as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Your body had become a perfect reflection of your social position, functional, productive, and disposable. It would serve its purpose for as long as it lasted, providing the labour that kept the manor running and the noble classes fed. And when it finally broke down completely, as everyone knew it eventually would, another young body would take its place, shaped by the same brutal forces into the same tragic form. The land that sustained you was also slowly killing you, and there was nothing you could do to escape its deadly embrace. Medieval agriculture wasn't just hard work. It was a constant battle against environmental forces that seemed determined to destroy everything you laboured to create. Every season brought new threats, each more devastating than the last, and you had learned to live in a state of perpetual anxiety about forces completely beyond your control. The weather had become your greatest enemy and your most unpredictable master. Unlike the nobles in their stone castles with their stored grain and imported luxuries, you lived entirely at the mercy of atmospheric conditions that could change from blessing to catastrophe in a matter of hours. A late spring frost could kill tender seedlings overnight, destroying months of preparation and leaving your family facing starvation before the growing season had properly begun. You had learned to read the subtle signs, the stillness in the air, the particular quality of the dawn light, the behaviour of birds and insects, that might give you a few hours' warning to cover vulnerable plants with whatever materials you could find. Drought was a slow-motion disaster that unfolded over weeks or months, each day without rain adding another layer of desperation to your increasingly frantic efforts to save the crops. You had watched strong men break down in tears as they stood in fields of withering grain, knowing that all their work was turning to dust under the relentless sun. The village well would drop lower and lower, forcing families to dig deeper or travel farther for the water that kept both crops and livestock alive. During the terrible drought of your 13th year, you had seen neighbours fighting over access to a muddy stream that barely qualified as water. Desperate people reduced to animal behaviour by the prospect of watching their children die of thirst. But if drought was slow torture, flooding was sudden apocalypse. When the spring rains came too hard and too fast, the carefully maintained drainage ditches would overflow, turning fields into temporary lakes that drowned crops and washed away precious topsoil that had taken generations to build up. You had waded through knee-deep water trying to save what you could, pulling up soggy vegetables and rescuing terrified chickens from improvised roosts, while the current tugged at your legs and threatened to sweep you away. The aftermath was always worse than the flood itself. Rotting vegetation, contaminated water supplies, and the knowledge that the growing season was effectively over before it had properly begun. Hailstorms were perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all weather-related disasters, because they struck without warning and left such complete destruction in their wake. You had lived through 3 major hailstorms, and each one remained etched in your memory like a scar. The sound was unforgettable, a roar like thousands of hammers striking the earth simultaneously, growing louder and more terrifying as the storm approached. Ice stones the size of chicken eggs would pummel the fields, shredding leaves, breaking stems, and beating ripening grain into the mud in a matter of minutes. Afterward, you would walk through what had been productive farmland that morning and see nothing but destruction. Crops that had looked ready for harvest reduced to green pulp scattered across the ground. The soil itself was both your livelihood and your adversary, requiring constant management and offering no guarantees even when you did everything correctly. Years of intensive cultivation had begun to exhaust the nutrients in many fields around Thornwick, leading to gradually declining yields despite increased labour. The 3-field rotation system that had sustained previous generations was showing signs of failure as the population grew and more land was pressed into service. You had watched fields that once produced abundant harvests struggle to yield enough grain to justify the effort of planting them. Erosion was an ongoing catastrophe that happened so gradually most people didn't notice until it was too late. Heavy rains would wash away topsoil from sloping fields, carrying years of careful cultivation downstream and leaving behind rocky, barren ground that grew weeds better than crops. You had spent countless hours building stone barriers and digging drainage channels to slow this process, but it felt like trying to hold back the tide with your bare hands. Each year you could see the good soil getting thinner, the rocky subsoil closer to the surface, the productivity of the land slowly but inexorably declining. Plant diseases arrived like invisible armies, spreading through crops with devastating efficiency. Ergot fungus would infect rye crops, producing poisonous compounds that could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and death in anyone who ate contaminated grain. Wheat rust could destroy an entire field in a matter of weeks, turning healthy green plants into withered brown stalks covered in orange spores that spread the infection to neighbouring fields. Barley smut would replace grain kernels with black powdery masses of fungal spores, rendering the harvest worthless and contaminating stored seed for future plantings. The insects were a plague of biblical proportions that arrived with predictable regularity but unpredictable intensity. Locust swarms could appear on the horizon like dark clouds, growing larger and more ominous as they approached, bringing with them the promise of total devastation. You had watched a locust invasion strip every green thing from the landscape in a matter of hours, leaving behind a moonscape of bare earth and broken stems. The sound was almost as terrible as the sight, millions of mandibles chewing simultaneously, creating a rustling, crackling noise that could be heard from miles away. Even when the weather cooperated and the crops grew healthy, animal pests could destroy months of work in a single night. Wild boars would break through fences and root up entire fields, destroying not just the current crop but damaging the soil structure for future plantings. Deer would browse on young shoots, rabbits would eat seedlings down to the ground, and birds would strip grain from ripening stalks with surgical precision. You had spent countless nights sleeping in the fields with crude noisemakers, trying to frighten away nocturnal raiders who seemed to sense exactly when crops were at their most vulnerable. The broader economic and political forces affecting agriculture were as destructive as any natural disaster and far more difficult to predict or prepare for. Wars between lords could disrupt trade routes, making it impossible to sell surplus crops or obtain necessary supplies like salt for preserving meat or iron for repairing tools. Military campaigns required provisions, and armies had a habit of simply taking what they needed from peasant farms without payment or compensation. You had hidden grain in concealed pits and driven livestock deep into the forest when word came that soldiers were approaching, knowing that resistance was futile, but hoping to save something from the inevitable plunder. Tax increases could be imposed without warning or explanation, forcing families to sell livestock, tools, or even seed grain to meet their obligations to lord and church. The tithe system meant that a tenth of everything you produced belonged to the church, regardless of how much your family needed it for survival. Bad years brought no reduction in these demands. If anything, authorities seemed to squeeze harder when peasant families were most vulnerable, as if poverty itself was proof of moral failing that justified additional punishment. Even the legal system was stacked against agricultural workers in ways that turned minor misfortunes into major catastrophes. If your ox strayed onto Lord Aldrich's domain land and damaged crops, you could be fined more than the animal was worth. If you were caught gleaning grain from harvested fields without permission, you faced prosecution for theft even if your family was starving. If you failed to perform labour service on the required days due to illness or family emergency, you could be punished with additional work obligations that made it even harder to tend your own fields. The cumulative effect of all these environmental and systemic pressures was a kind of chronic stress that wore down both body and spirit. You lived in constant fear of the next disaster, the next demand, the next crisis that could destroy everything you had worked to build. Sleep was difficult when you knew that storm clouds on the horizon might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Relaxation was impossible when any moment of inattention could allow pests or diseases to gain a foothold in your crops. This was the reality of medieval farming, not just hard work, but an endless war against forces that seemed designed to ensure your failure. And the most maddening part was that none of these challenges were optional or avoidable. You couldn't choose to farm in a better climate, negotiate fairer taxes, or protect your crops from weather and pests. You could only endure, adapt, and hope that somehow, against all odds, you would survive long enough to face the same challenges again next year. The worst part about being a medieval farmer wasn't the backbreaking labour, or even the constant threat of starvation. It was the suffocating realization that everyone wanted a piece of what little you managed to produce, and they all acted as if they were doing you a favour by taking it. You weren't just fighting against weather and disease to grow enough food to survive. You were locked in an endless battle against a system of obligations and expectations that seemed designed to ensure you never accumulated enough to escape your circumstances. Lord Aldrich's demands came first and most frequently, delivered through Henrik the Reeve with the casual authority of someone who had never wondered where his next meal would come from. 3 days of labour service per week on the domain lands wasn't a suggestion. It was a legal obligation enforced by the threat of fines, imprisonment, or banishment from the only home you had ever known. But those 3 days had a way of expanding whenever the Lord's needs became pressing. Harvest time on his fields always seemed to coincide with the optimal harvest time for your own crops, forcing you to choose between fulfilling your legal obligations and saving your family from hunger. The labour service itself was deliberately humiliating, designed to remind you constantly of your place in the social hierarchy. While your own crops withered in the fields waiting for attention, you would spend precious daylight hours weeding Lord Aldrich's herb garden, cleaning his stables, or repairing fences around pastures where his prized hunting horses grazed on grass that could have fed your family's livestock. The work was often pointless, busy work, tasks that could have been completed by the Lord's household servants but were assigned to villains as a demonstration of power rather than economic necessity. Church obligations formed another relentless drain on your time and resources. Father Benedict's interpretation of Christian duty seemed to require an endless stream of contributions from those least able to afford them. The tithe wasn't just 10% of your grain harvest. It was 10% of everything. Vegetables, eggs, wool, even the few coins you might earn from selling surplus produce at market. The church claimed this wealth was needed to support God's work, but you had noticed that God's work apparently required Father Benedict to eat better than anyone else in the village while preaching about the virtue of poverty. Religious festivals, which should have provided respite from daily toil, instead became additional sources of obligation and expense. Easter required eggs when your chickens had barely begun laying after the harsh winter. Christmas demanded contributions of meat when your family could barely afford to slaughter animals for their own survival. Saints' feast days meant additional labour maintaining church property, time stolen from your own fields during critical periods of the growing season. The manor court system created yet another layer of financial obligation disguised as justice. Monthly court sessions weren't optional social gatherings. They were mandatory appearances where you could be fined for infractions you didn't know you had committed. Failing to maintain your section of the village fence could result in a penalty that cost more than building a new fence. Allowing your animals to stray onto common land at the wrong time could trigger fines that exceeded the value of the animals themselves. Even speaking disrespectfully to Henrik or failing to remove your hat quickly enough when the Lord passed could result in monetary penalties that your family couldn't afford. The economic exploitation extended far beyond official obligations into a web of informal but equally binding expectations. When your neighbours faced crisis, social pressure demanded that you share your limited resources even when your own family was struggling. Refusing to help during barn raising, harvest emergencies, or family tragedies marked you as antisocial and could lead to exclusion from the cooperation networks that made survival possible. But helping meant less time for your own work and fewer resources for your own family's needs. Market obligations created another form of economic bondage. You were required to sell your surplus grain and livestock at the Lord's market, where prices were set by his agents and heavily favoured buyers over sellers. The market tolls, stall fees, and various taxes consumed a significant portion of any profit, while regulations prevented you from seeking better prices elsewhere. Even when you managed to sell products for a decent price, guild monopolies and trade restrictions meant that everything you needed to buy, tools, cloth, salt, iron, cost far more than equivalent goods should have in a fair market. Marriage became another source of financial obligation rather than economic partnership. When your sister Margot reached marriageable age, your family was required to pay Merchett to Lord Aldrich for permission to marry her to young Edwin from the neighbouring village. The fee represented several months of surplus income that your family desperately needed for other purposes. But refusing to pay would have condemned Margot to spinsterhood and your family to supporting her indefinitely, making the extortionate payment seem like the lesser of two terrible options. Inheritance taxes ensured that even death provided no escape from financial obligation. When old Willem the shepherd died, his family was required to surrender his best ox to Lord Aldrich as Heriot, supposedly in recognition of the Lord's generosity in allowing Willem to use manor land during his lifetime. The surviving family then had to pay relief fees to continue working the same strips of land they had cultivated for generations. These death taxes often forced grieving families to sell their remaining livestock or tools, leaving them worse off than before and ensuring that accumulated wealth rarely passed from one generation to the next. Military obligations added another layer of unpredictable demand. When conflicts arose between lords or when royal levies were called, able-bodied men could be conscripted for military service with little warning and no compensation. Your older brother Cerdic had been taken for 6 months during the border dispute with the neighbouring duchy, leaving your family short-handed during the crucial planting season. He returned injured and unable to work at full capacity, adding to the family's burdens rather than relieving them. Even your children became sources of obligation rather than assets. Sons owed labour service from the moment they were capable of useful work, while daughters required dowries that your family could ill afford. Education was not only unavailable, but actively discouraged. Teaching peasant children to read and write was seen as a waste of resources that could be better spent on productive labour. Your children would inherit your obligations along with your poverty, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation continued indefinitely. The psychological toll of these endless demands was perhaps worse than the physical hardship. You could never fully relax or feel secure because there was always another obligation looming, another payment due, another service required. Success in improving your family's situation only seemed to attract additional attention from those who wanted a share of any prosperity you managed to achieve. The harder you worked and the more efficiently you farmed, the more everyone else expected you to contribute to their various schemes and obligations. This was the true genius of the feudal system. It wasn't designed to help anyone escape poverty, but rather to ensure that productive people remained trapped in positions where their labour could be exploited indefinitely. The obligations weren't bugs in the system. They were features, carefully designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth or power by those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Every demand was justified by tradition, religion, or law, making resistance seem not just futile but morally wrong. You were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to serve your betters, to find fulfillment in your assigned role, and to accept that questioning the system was tantamount to questioning the divine order itself. The endless cycle of obligations had been sanctified by centuries of custom and blessed by religious authority, transforming economic exploitation into a sacred duty that you were honoured to fulfill. After surrendering the lion's share of your labour and produced to satisfy the endless demands of lord, church and manor, what remained barely qualified as living. The most basic human needs, food, shelter, cleanliness, rest and companionship, had been reduced to desperate struggles against scarcity, discomfort and exhaustion. You existed rather than lived, maintaining just enough functionality to continue working while everything that might have made life bearable slowly withered away. Food had become an obsession born of perpetual hunger, rather than any pleasure in eating. Your daily bread wasn't the golden, crusty loaves that graced Lord Aldrich's table, but dense, dark masses made from whatever grain was left after tithes, taxes and rent. The flour was often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or even clay to make it stretch further, creating a substance that filled your stomach without providing much nourishment. During the worst months, usually the period between winter's end and spring's first harvest, known grimly as the hungry gap, your bread might contain more filler than actual grain. Meat was a fantasy reserved for feast days and special occasions, assuming your family could afford to slaughter one of their precious animals. Most of the year, protein came from eggs when the chickens were laying, milk when the cow was producing, and small amounts of cheese or butter made from whatever dairy surplus couldn't be sold or traded. Fish was available only to those living near streams or ponds, and even then, fishing rights were often restricted by manor law, making poaching a desperate but dangerous option. Vegetables provided some nutrition during the growing season, but preservation methods were primitive and unreliable. Root vegetables stored in underground pits might last through winter if they didn't rot, freeze, or get eaten by rodents. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut, but the process required salt that was expensive and sometimes unavailable. Most green vegetables had to be eaten fresh during the brief period when they were available, leaving long months when your diet consisted almost entirely of bread, thin gruel, and whatever scraps of preserved food remained from the previous harvest. The hunger wasn't just physical discomfort, it was a constant mental fog that made thinking difficult and emotions unstable. You had learned to ignore the gnawing sensation in your stomach, but you couldn't ignore how hunger made you irritable, distracted, and prone to mistakes that could have serious consequences. Hungry people made poor decisions, overlooked important details, and sometimes took desperate risks that endangered themselves and their families. Your shelter was barely adequate protection against the elements, let alone a place of comfort or privacy. The family hut remained essentially unchanged from your childhood, a single room shared with parents, siblings, and livestock, where every activity from cooking to sleeping to giving birth took place in the same cramped space. The walls leaked cold air in winter and provided little relief from summer heat. The thatched roof required constant maintenance to remain even marginally waterproof, and replacing thatch meant time away from more pressing agricultural duties. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist in your world. Personal space, quiet time for reflection, or intimate moments with a spouse had to be stolen in brief interludes when others were absent or asleep. The lack of private space created constant tension and friction between family members who never had a moment's respite from each other's presence. Arguments that might have been brief conflicts in more spacious circumstances became lingering resentments when there was nowhere to go to cool off or gain perspective. Sleep had become another battleground rather than a refuge from daily struggles. Your straw mattress was shared with various insects, rodents, and parasites that made restful sleep nearly impossible. The straw was replaced only when it became so infested or rotted that it was unbearable, and fresh straw was expensive and hard to obtain during certain seasons. Winter nights were an endurance test of cold that penetrated every layer of clothing and bedding, while summer nights brought stifling heat and swarms of biting insects. The physical exhaustion from daily labour should have made sleep come easily, but chronic pain, worry about the next day's challenges, and the constant noise of family members and animals in the same small space created a state of perpetual semi-consciousness rather than genuine rest. You learned to function on fragments of sleep snatched between disturbances, never fully rested but too tired to stay properly awake. Personal hygiene had deteriorated from difficult to nearly impossible. Bathing required heating water over a fire that was needed for cooking, using fuel that was scarce and expensive. Full body washing happened perhaps a few times per year, usually in connection with religious festivals or major life events. Daily washing was limited to face and hands using cold water from wells or streams, assuming water was available and not frozen or contaminated. Your clothes were functional garments worn until they literally fell apart, then mended repeatedly until mending was no longer possible. You owned perhaps 2 sets of clothing, one for work and one slightly better outfit for church and special occasions. Both were made from coarse, undyed fabric that was rough against the skin and provided minimal protection against weather extremes. Undergarments were luxuries that peasant families couldn't afford, adding to the discomfort and hygiene challenges. The smell that surrounded you constantly was a mixture of unwashed bodies, animal dung, rotting straw, wood smoke, and whatever other odours accumulated in a space that was never properly cleaned or aired out. You had become nose-blind to most of these smells, but visitors from outside the village often recoiled from the concentrated essence of poverty and poor sanitation that clung to peasant households. Social isolation was perhaps the cruelest deprivation of all. Your world had shrunk to the boundaries of Thornwick village and the immediate surrounding fields. Travel beyond the manor's borders required permission that was rarely granted and would have been impossible to afford anyway. News from the outside world came through merchants, pilgrims, and occasional official messengers, but it felt as remote and irrelevant as stories from fairy tales. Marriage and family relationships, which should have provided emotional sustenance, were often strained by the constant pressure of survival. Romantic love was a luxury that few could afford when marriage was primarily an economic arrangement designed to pool resources and labour. Children were viewed more as future workers than objects of affection, and the high rate of infant mortality made it dangerous to become too emotionally attached too quickly. Educational and intellectual stimulation were completely absent from your life. Books were rare and expensive, and even if you could have afforded them, reading was a skill reserved for the clergy and nobility. Your mental world was limited to practical knowledge about farming, local gossip, and the religious instruction provided by Father Benedict, whose sermons rarely deviated from themes of obedience, suffering, and the virtue of poverty. Entertainment consisted of whatever diversions could be created from available materials and stolen time. Folk songs, storytelling around the fire, and simple games provided brief respites from the grinding routine of work and survival. Religious festivals offered the closest thing to community celebration, but even these were often overshadowed by the additional obligations and expenses they required. The cumulative effect of these compromised basic needs was a kind of spiritual starvation that was harder to bear than physical deprivation. You had learned to survive on insufficient food, inadequate shelter, and minimal rest, but the absence of beauty, comfort, and hope created a deeper hunger that no amount of bread could satisfy. Life had been reduced to its most basic biological functions, working, eating, sleeping, and reproducing, with little room for the experiences that might have made survival worthwhile. Yet somehow, in the midst of this systematic deprivation, you continued to find moments of connection, meaning, and even joy. A shared laugh with a neighbour, pride in a successful harvest, the warmth of family gathered around the fire on a cold night. These small human moments provided just enough sustenance to keep going, to face another day of struggle, to believe that somehow, against all evidence, tomorrow might be slightly better than today. The cruelest irony of your existence came when you realized you were actively preparing your own children to inherit the same misery that had consumed your life. At 25, with your body already showing the wear of 2 decades of brutal labor, you found yourself in the position your father had once occupied, teaching the next generation how to survive in a system designed to destroy them. The knowledge you passed down wasn't wisdom or enlightenment, but techniques for enduring suffering with dignity and efficiency. Your eldest son, little Edmund, was now 7 years old and had already begun his education in agricultural bondage. You watched yourself become the harsh taskmaster you had once feared in your own father, driven not by cruelty but by the desperate knowledge that tenderness was a luxury that could kill. When Edmund flinched from the weight of the water buckets, you forced steel into your voice and made him carry them anyway, because weakness in the fields could mean death during harvest. When he cried from the blisters forming on his soft hands, you showed him your own scarred palms and explained that pain was the price of survival. The lessons you taught weren't the gentle guidance a child should receive, but brutal truths that would prepare him for a life of exploitation and hardship. You taught him to bow his head when Henrik approached, to never question an order from his betters, to accept punishment for crimes he hadn't committed because resistance would only make things worse. You were training him to be docile, obedient, and productive, qualities that would keep him alive but would also ensure his enslavement. Your wife, Agnes, bore the additional burden of preparing your daughter Matilda for a life that would be even more restrictive than Edmund's. Medieval society offered women fewer options and more dangers, making the education of daughters an exercise in teaching them to navigate a world that viewed them primarily as property to be transferred between men. Agnes taught Matilda to spin, weave, cook, and tend animals, but she also taught her subtler lessons about surviving in a world where women had no legal rights and few protections. The marriage negotiations for your sister Margot had provided a harsh education in the economic realities of family life. Arranging her union with Edwin of Westwick required months of careful planning and resource allocation that strained your family's finances to the breaking point. The bride price, feast expenses, and various fees associated with the ceremony consumed nearly a year's worth of surplus income, leaving your family more vulnerable than before. But refusing to arrange the marriage would have condemned Margot to permanent dependency and your family to supporting an additional adult indefinitely. The wedding itself was a bittersweet affair that highlighted the fundamental contradictions of peasant life. The celebration was genuine. Margot and Edwin seemed to care for each other, and their union would create valuable alliances between your families, but the underlying economics were brutal. Margot would move to Edwin's village and become part of his family's labour force, while your family lost a productive worker and gained nothing except the hope that the connection might prove valuable during future crises. Watching your children grow meant confronting the reality that you were perpetuating a system you despised. Edmund would inherit your obligations to Lord Aldrich, your strips of land in the common fields, and your status as a villain bound to the manor. Matilda would be married off to create economic alliances and political connections, her preferences and desires secondary to the family's survival needs. Neither child would have choices about their future occupation, place of residence, or fundamental life decisions. The tools you passed down were worn smooth by generations of desperate hands. The wooden plough that would someday belong to Edmund bore the marks of your father's grip, your grandfather's repairs, and countless seasons of breaking the stubborn earth. The spinning wheel that Agnes was teaching Matilda to use had been crafted by your wife's grandmother and would likely serve Matilda's daughters as well. These weren't heirlooms in any meaningful sense. They were the instruments of survival, passed down because replacement was impossible, rather than because they held sentimental value. Teaching your children to read the land and weather felt like passing on a sacred mystery, even though you knew the knowledge would bind them to agricultural labour forever. You showed Edmund how to judge soil moisture by its smell, how to predict rain by watching cloud formations, how to determine the optimal planting depth for different seeds. These skills would keep him alive, but they would also ensure that he never escaped the fields that had claimed your own life. The religious instruction you provided carried the same double-edged quality as every other lesson. You taught your children to pray, to respect the church, and to find comfort in religious faith, but you also taught them that their earthly suffering was divinely ordained and that questioning the social order was tantamount to heresy. Religion provided psychological consolation while simultaneously justifying their oppression, making resistance seem not just futile but sinful. The social skills you passed down were lessons in submission disguised as practical wisdom. You taught Edmund to recognize the footsteps of different authority figures, to judge the mood of Henrik the Reeve by his posture and tone, to anticipate punishment and minimize its severity through proper displays of contrition. These were survival skills that had kept your family alive for generations, but they were also the mechanisms through which oppression perpetuated itself. Your children's education in violence came through observation, rather than direct instruction. They watched you submit to unjust treatment, accept blame for problems beyond your control, and endure humiliation without protest. They learned that might made right, that fairness was a luxury for the powerful, and that survival depended on making yourself useful to people who viewed you as property rather than human beings. The most heartbreaking aspect of preparing the next generation was the need to crush their natural curiosity and imagination. When Edmund asked why the Lord lived in a stone castle, while your family shared their hut with animals, you had to teach him that such questions were dangerous. When Matilda wondered why women couldn't own land or make their own decisions, you had to explain that challenging the natural order would bring punishment on the entire family. Yet despite the systematic crushing of hope and possibility, you found yourself trying to pass down something more than mere survival techniques. In quiet moments you told your children stories of their ancestors, shared folk songs that carried memories of better times, and tried to instill values of kindness, courage, and dignity that might help them maintain their humanity despite the dehumanizing circumstances of their lives. The cycle of inheritance extended beyond your immediate family to encompass the entire village. You watched as other parents faced the same terrible choices, preparing their children for lives of hardship while trying to preserve some spark of joy and meaning. The community that emerged from this shared suffering was both precious and tragic. Bonds forged in desperation that provided emotional sustenance while perpetuating the system that created the desperation in the first place. Training the next generation meant confronting your own mortality and the limited nature of your legacy. You wouldn't be remembered in history books or commemorated with monuments. Your children might remember your specific lessons for a generation or two, but eventually your individual identity would fade into the anonymous mass of peasant ancestors who had lived, suffered, and died in obscurity. Your only lasting contribution would be the survival skills you passed down, and the small improvements you made to tools, techniques, or relationships that might ease the burden for future generations. The knowledge that your children would face the same struggles you had endured was almost unbearable, but the alternative, failing to prepare them adequately, was worse. Every harsh lesson you taught, every moment of tenderness you withheld, every dream you crushed was motivated by love, expressed through the brutal calculus of survival. You were preparing them not for the life you wished they could have, but for the life they actually would have, in a world that offered few second chances and no mercy for the unprepared. By your 35th year, the inevitable reckoning had begun. Your body, which had somehow endured 2 decades of punishment that would have killed a softer man, finally started to surrender to the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent fighting, losing battles against nature, authority, and time itself. The decline wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of collapse, no heroic final stand. Instead, it was a gradual erosion, like watching a stone wall crumble one pebble at a time until you suddenly realized the structure could no longer bear its own weight. The morning pain had evolved from a temporary stiffness that could be worked out through movement into a permanent ache that settled deeper into your bones with each passing season. Your back, which had curved into its agricultural shape during adolescence, now refused to straighten even partially. The simple act of standing upright became a conscious effort that required planning and preparation, and sitting down felt like lowering yourself into a pit from which you might not emerge. Your hands, those scarred and callous tools that had shaped your entire existence, began to betray you in small but terrifying ways. The grip strength that had once allowed you to wrestle with stubborn oxen and handle rough timber now faltered at crucial moments. Tools would slip from your grasp when you least expected it, sometimes causing injuries, always causing the kind of embarrassment that cut deeper than physical pain. The fine motor control needed for delicate tasks like mending harnesses or sorting seeds became increasingly difficult as arthritis transformed your fingers into clumsy swollen appendages. Your knees, which had carried you across countless miles of uneven farmland, began to lock up without warning. What started as occasional stiffness progressed to episodes where you would find yourself temporarily unable to bend or straighten your legs, forcing you to lean against whatever support was available until the joint decided to cooperate again. Walking on uneven ground became treacherous, and the confidence that had once allowed you to navigate muddy fields in darkness was replaced by a cautious, shuffling gait that made you feel older than your years. The respiratory problems that had begun as a persistent cough from years of breathing dust and chaff escalated into episodes of genuine breathing difficulty. Exertion that you had once handled without conscious thought now left you gasping and wheezing, forcing frequent stops to catch your breath. The irony wasn't lost on you. Just as your experience and knowledge reached their peak, your body's ability to act on that knowledge was failing catastrophically. Edmund, now 15, and approaching the physical prime you remembered from your own youth, began to shoulder more of the heavy labour without being asked. You tried to maintain the pretense that you were still the primary worker, but both of you understood that a transition was underway. The day he completed the spring ploughing without your assistance marked a watershed moment. You were no longer indispensable to your family's survival, and the recognition brought a mixture of pride and existential terror. The village dynamics shifted subtly but unmistakably as your physical decline became apparent to others. Henrik the Reeve began directing work assignments to Edmund rather than you, acknowledging the change in your family's labour capacity without explicitly commenting on your deteriorating condition. Neighbours who had once sought your advice on technical farming matters started consulting your son instead, recognising that your value was increasingly historical rather than practical. Agnes bore the additional burden of caring for a husband whose body was failing while managing her own responsibilities and helping to train the next generation. She had married a strong young man capable of protecting and providing for her. Now she found herself married to an increasingly frail invalid who required assistance with tasks that had once been automatic. The strain showed in her face, her posture, and her increasingly short temper with the children. Your relationship with Lord Aldrich's administration became another source of anxiety, as your diminished capacity became apparent. The manor system depended on each villain family, providing consistent labour output, and your declining productivity threatened the delicate balance that kept your family's obligations manageable. There were whispers about families who had lost their land rights when the primary worker became too disabled to fulfil his duties, and you lived in constant fear that your condition might trigger such consequences. The psychological adjustment to physical decline proved even more challenging than the bodily changes themselves. Your entire identity had been built around your ability to work, to endure, to provide for your family through physical labour. As that capacity diminished, you struggled to understand who you were and what your place in the world might be. The skills and knowledge that had taken decades to accumulate seemed increasingly irrelevant if you lacked the physical capacity to apply them. Sleep became more elusive, as chronic pain made it difficult to find comfortable positions for rest. The few hours of relief that sleep had once provided were replaced by fitful dozing, interrupted by joint pain, muscle cramps, and the anxiety that came with contemplating your family's future. Exhaustion became a constant companion, but it was the exhaustion of suffering rather than honest labour, providing none of the satisfaction that had once made sleep feel earned. Your appetite began to fail as digestive problems that had been manageable nuisances developed into serious impediments to nutrition. The coarse bread and simple foods that had sustained you through decades of hard work now seemed to pass through your system without providing much nourishment. Weight loss made you appear even more frail than your limitations suggested, and the combination of reduced food intake and continued physical demands created a downward spiral that seemed impossible to reverse. The transfer of responsibility to Edmund accelerated as your limitations became more pronounced. Decision-making authority passed gradually from father to son, not through any formal ceremony, but through the practical necessity of having someone capable of implementing plans. You found yourself in the strange position of being consulted for advice, while being excluded from the physical execution of that advice, a kind of emeritus status that felt more like exile than honour. Preparing for the inevitable required confronting questions that had no good answers. When would you become completely unable to work? How long could your family support a non-productive member? What would happen to Agnes and the younger children if your decline continued to drain resources without providing any economic return? These weren't abstract philosophical questions, but practical concerns that demanded difficult decisions. The village had seen this transition many times before, and the patterns were well established if not explicitly discussed. Men who became too disabled to work faced a gradual marginalization that usually ended in death from illness, accident, or simple inability to maintain the struggle for survival. There were few examples of graceful aging in peasant society, and the precedents you could observe offered little hope for a dignified conclusion to your story. Yet despite the physical decline and psychological challenges, you found unexpected sources of meaning in your changing role. Teaching Edmund and Matilda became more than practical necessity. It became a way of ensuring that your accumulated knowledge wouldn't die with you. The stories you told them about farming techniques, village history, and family traditions took on greater importance, as you realized these conversations might be your most lasting contribution to their future success. The community relationships that had once been primarily economic began to take on more personal dimensions, as your role shifted from provider to elder. Neighbours who had worked alongside you for decades started treating you with a different kind of respect, acknowledging your experience and seeking your counsel, even as your physical contributions diminished. This transformation from worker to advisor offered a new form of value that partially compensated for the loss of productive capacity. Your declining years were teaching you that survival could take many forms, and that usefulness didn't necessarily end when physical strength failed. The challenge was finding ways to contribute that justified the resources your care required, while accepting that your days of being the family's primary asset were definitively over. The end came not with drama or ceremony, but with the quiet inevitability of a candle burning down to its final stub. At 38 years old, an age that would be considered early middle age in more comfortable circumstances, your body finally surrendered to the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent in service to forces that had never cared whether you lived or died. The winter of 1363 proved to be your last, though no one recognized it as such until the final weeks when even your legendary stubbornness couldn't maintain the pretense that recovery was possible. The illness that claimed you wasn't exotic or mysterious. It was the same respiratory ailment that had taken your father and would likely claim Edmund in his time. Years of breathing grain dust, chaff, smoke, and the general pollution of medieval agricultural life had finally overwhelmed your lungs' ability to function. What started as your familiar chronic cough gradually deepened into something more sinister, producing blood-flecked phlegm and leaving you gasping for breath after the simplest exertions. Agnes tried the traditional remedies that had sometimes helped with previous illnesses. She brewed teas from herbs gathered in the forest, applied poultices to your chest, and even convinced Father Benedict to perform special prayers for your recovery. But everyone understood, without speaking it aloud, that this was different from the seasonal ailments and minor injuries that had punctuated your adult life. This was the final accounting for decades of physical abuse that no amount of folk medicine could address. The last month of your life was spent primarily in the family hut, propped up against the wall where breathing came easier than lying flat. You watched through the single window as Edmund managed the winter tasks that had once been your responsibility, maintaining tools, planning for spring planting, negotiating with Henrik about the family's obligations for the coming year. Your son moved with the confident efficiency you remembered from your own young manhood, and you felt a mixture of pride and sorrow, recognizing that your role in the world's work was definitively finished. Your final conversations with Edmund weren't sentimental declarations of love or wisdom-filled speeches about the meaning of life. They were practical discussions about debt obligations, tool maintenance schedules, and which fields would need extra attention during the next growing season. You shared the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades worth of farming experience, trying to compress into a few weeks the subtle understandings that normally took years to develop. The urgency of these conversations was understood by both of you, though neither spoke directly about why speed was necessary. Matilda, now 12, and already showing the competence that would make her a valuable addition to some future husband's household, spent hours spinning beside your bed and listening to stories about her grandparents, great-grandparents, and the family traditions that connected your humble lineage to something larger than individual survival. These stories weren't grand narratives of heroic achievement, but quiet tales of ordinary people who had endured extraordinary hardships with dignity and occasional grace. Agnes maintained her duties with the grim efficiency of someone who had learned not to indulge in emotions that wouldn't change practical outcomes. She cared for you with the same methodical attention she gave to tending sick animals, monitoring your condition, providing what comfort was possible, and making realistic assessments about prognosis without allowing sentiment to cloud her judgment. There would be time for grief later. Now there was only the work of managing a family crisis. The village response to your decline followed established patterns that had evolved over generations of similar situations. Neighbours offered assistance with immediate tasks while carefully avoiding commitments that might become long-term obligations. They brought small amounts of food, helped with essential maintenance, and provided the social support that made survival possible in a world without institutional safety nets. But everyone understood that ultimately your family would need to manage this transition independently. Henrik the Reeve visited during your final week, ostensibly to check on your condition, but actually to assess the family's continued viability as a productive unit within the manor system. His questions about Edmund's capabilities and Agnes's plans were politely phrased but fundamentally economic in nature. Your death would trigger various obligations and adjustments that needed to be planned for in advance, and the manor administration couldn't afford to be sentimental about individual tragedies. The actual moment of death came during a February night when the wind howled around the hut and snow drifted against the walls. You simply stopped breathing sometime between midnight and dawn, slipping away so quietly that Agnes didn't realize you were gone until she tried to give you water at sunrise. There was no dramatic final statement, no last-minute revelations or reconciliations. You died as you had lived, without fanfare, making as little trouble as possible for the people who would have to clean up after you. Edmund took charge of the immediate aftermath with the kind of practical competence that would have made you proud if you had been alive to witness it. He sent word to Father Benedict, arranged for the body's preparation, and began the complex process of notifying relevant authorities about the change in family status. Your son understood that grief was a luxury that would have to wait until after the bureaucratic requirements of death had been satisfied. The funeral was a brief, simple affair that reflected both your social status and the practical constraints of winter weather. Father Benedict performed the necessary rituals with the same efficiency he brought to all peasant ceremonies, respectful but not elaborate, acknowledging your humanity while maintaining appropriate distinctions between your death and those of more important people. Your body was wrapped in the family's best cloth and buried in the village churchyard, marked with a simple wooden cross that would rot away within a few years. Lord Aldrich's claim of Harriet was exercised immediately after the burial, with his agent selecting the family's best ox as payment for the privilege of having used manor land during your lifetime. This transaction was conducted with businesslike efficiency that ignored the emotional impact on your surviving family members. The ox represented months of accumulated wealth and future productive capacity, but death taxes were not subject to negotiation based on family circumstances. Agnes faced the challenge of maintaining the family's economic position, while adjusting to life without a husband's labour and protection. Her status shifted from wife to widow, which carried different legal implications and social expectations within the manor system. She would need to prove the family's continued viability or risk losing their land rights entirely, a pressure that added urgency to every decision about resource allocation and family planning. The immediate impact of your death extended beyond your immediate family to affect the broader networks of cooperation and mutual obligation that sustained village life. Neighbours who had relied on your labour during harvest emergencies would need to find alternative sources of assistance. Families who had borrowed tools or expertise from you would need to develop new relationships with other villagers. The social capital you had accumulated over decades of community participation evaporated with your death, leaving gaps that would take time to fill. Your tools and agricultural equipment became Edmund's inheritance, passing to him along with the accumulated debts and obligations that came with adult status in the manor system. The wooden plough that had served 3 generations would continue working the same strips of land under a 4th generation's guidance. The cycle would continue, driven by the same economic forces that had shaped your own life, with only the names and faces changing while the fundamental relationships remained constant. Within weeks of your death, the village had adjusted to your absence with the same resilience that had allowed it to survive countless other losses over the centuries. Your name might be remembered for a generation or two, but your individual story would eventually merge into the anonymous mass of peasant experience that formed the foundation of medieval society. You had lived, worked, suffered, and died as countless others had before you, leaving behind only the faint traces that any human life creates in its passage through the world. You never owned a castle, commanded an army, or had your portrait painted for posterity. Your name appears in no chronicles, your deeds inspired no ballads, and your grave marker rotted away before your grandchildren could read. Yet in the grand tapestry of human civilization, you were not insignificant. You were essential. In ways that kings and nobles never understood, and historians rarely acknowledge, you, and millions like you, built the world that came after, one grain of wheat and one day of backbreaking labour at a time. While lords measured their power in gold and territory, your influence was measured in sustenance. Every loaf of bread that fed a scholar working by candlelight contained grain that passed through your scarred hands. Every feast that celebrated royal victories was made possible by vegetables you coaxed from reluctant soil. The armies that marched across Europe carried provisions that originated in fields ploughed by men whose names were forgotten before the battles were fought. You fed the world, and in feeding it, you made everything else possible. The knowledge you accumulated through decades of intimate contact with soil, weather, and growing things was more sophisticated than most university learning of your era. You understood complex ecological relationships that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for centuries. Your ability to read subtle environmental signals, predict weather patterns, and judge soil conditions represented a form of practical intelligence that university-trained scholars couldn't match. Yet this wisdom died with you because it was never written down, never formally recognized, never valued by those who controlled the mechanisms of knowledge preservation. Your children carried forward fragments of your understanding, but they also carried the social constraints that prevented them from building upon your foundation. Edmund would farm the same strips of land using the same techniques, constrained by the same obligations that had limited your own potential. Matilda would marry into another farming family and apply her skills to keeping another household alive through another generation of struggle. The incremental improvements you made to tools, techniques, and survival strategies would survive only as long as they proved useful to people with no leisure to contemplate their origins. The economic system that exploited your labour also depended absolutely upon it. Lord Aldrich's stone manor house, with its glass windows and carved decorations, was built from surplus wealth extracted from families like yours. The elaborate ceremonies of medieval court life, the intricate political alliances between noble houses, the very concept of aristocratic leisure, all of it rested on the foundation of agricultural productivity that you and your peers provided. Without your labour, the entire social structure would have collapsed within a single growing season. Your suffering was not meaningless, even though it was invisible to those who benefited most from it. Every back-breaking day you endured represented a small victory against chaos, entropy, and starvation. Every successful harvest was a triumph of human will over natural forces that cared nothing for human survival. Every winter your family survived was proof that ordinary people could endure extraordinary hardships and still maintain their humanity, their dignity, and their capacity for love. The village of Thornwick itself was a monument to collaborative human achievement that rivaled anything built from stone and mortar. The complex systems of cooperation, resource sharing, and mutual support that allowed dozens of families to survive in harsh conditions represented a form of social engineering that was both sophisticated and compassionate. You helped build and maintain a community that functioned effectively for centuries, adapting to changing conditions while preserving the essential knowledge and relationships that made survival possible. Your descendants would eventually escape the constraints that defined your existence, though they would never completely escape the consequences of those constraints. The agricultural surplus you helped create would eventually support enough non-farming specialists to make technological and social progress possible. The population growth enabled by improved farming techniques would create pressures that would eventually break down the feudal system that had trapped your family for generations. Your great-great-grandchildren might live in towns, learn to read, choose their own occupations, and imagine futures that extended beyond the next harvest. But they would also carry forward the psychological and physical legacy of generations spent in agricultural bondage. The habits of deference, the acceptance of hardship, the suspicion of authority, and the deep understanding of scarcity would persist long after the conditions that created them had changed. The genetic damage from poor nutrition, environmental toxins, and chronic stress would influence the health and development of descendants you would never meet. Your legacy was written in their bones, their reflexes, and their dreams. The environmental knowledge you possessed, understanding of local weather patterns, soil conditions, plant and animal behavior, represented a form of ecological wisdom that industrial agriculture would later abandon at great cost. Your intimate relationship with the land created sustainable practices that modern farming is still trying to rediscover. The biodiversity you helped maintain through traditional seed saving and crop rotation practices preserved genetic resources that would become crucial for future food security. In the broader sweep of human history, your era was a bridge between the classical world and the Renaissance, between subsistence and surplus, between local isolation and global connection. The agricultural intensification that people like you made possible created the economic foundation for the technological and cultural achievements that would follow. The medieval period that seemed so dark and limited from the inside was actually a crucial phase of human development that repaired the ground for everything that came after. Your individual story, a life of hardship, exploitation, and early death, was tragic when viewed in isolation. But when multiplied by millions of similar lives across centuries of European history, it becomes something else, the foundation story of modern civilization. Every person who has ever had enough to eat, lived in a heated home, or enjoyed the luxury of contemplating questions beyond immediate survival has benefited from the accumulated labor of people whose lives resembled yours. The tools you used, refined through generations of practical experience, evolved into the machines that would eventually revolutionize agriculture. The techniques you developed for preserving food, managing livestock, and organizing labor provided the basis for industrial processes that would transform human civilization. The social relationships you helped create and maintain became the models for more complex forms of organization that would govern larger populations and more sophisticated economies. Perhaps most importantly, you proved that human beings could maintain their essential humanity, even under conditions designed to reduce them to mere labor units. Despite everything that was taken from you, your health, your choices, your security, your dignity, you never stopped caring for your family, helping your neighbors, and finding small moments of joy in the midst of overwhelming hardship. You demonstrated that the human spirit was more durable than the systems designed to crush it. Your grave may be unmarked and your name forgotten, but your legacy lives on in every field that feeds the hungry, every community that cares for its vulnerable members, and every family that chooses hope over despair in the face of impossible odds. You are not just a medieval farmer, you are a testament to the enduring power of ordinary people to create extraordinary things through the simple act of refusing to give up. The wheat still grows in the fields around Thornwick, tended now by machines rather than human hands. But the grain that feeds the world today carries within it the genetic memory of seeds you saved, soil you enriched, and knowledge you preserved. In every harvest, in every meal, in every person who has enough to eat, something of you continues. You built the world with your hands, your sweat, and your unsung heroism. And in the end, that is legacy enough for any human life. 600 years have passed since your final breath misted in the cold February air of that humble hut in Thornwick. The village itself has long since disappeared, swallowed by time and progress, its exact location now debated by historians who study old maps and archaeological fragments. But the fields remember. The soil that absorbed your sweat, your blood, and finally your mortal remains still bears the invisible imprint of countless lives like yours. If you could return today to the valley where Thornwick once stood, you would find it transformed beyond recognition. Where your family's strips of land once lay, modern machinery moves across vast consolidated fields with mechanical precision that would seem like magic to your medieval eyes. A single tractor guided by satellites orbiting in space can accomplish in one day what would have taken your entire village weeks to complete. The backbreaking labour that defined every moment of your existence has been replaced by technology that operates with inhuman efficiency. Yet beneath this technological marvel, the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. The soil still needs to be prepared, seeds still require planting at precisely the right moment, and harvests still depend on the delicate balance between human intention and natural forces. The farmers who work this land today face different challenges: commodity prices instead of feudal obligations, climate change instead of simple weather uncertainty, global markets instead of manner restrictions. But they share with you the ancient anxiety of those who understand that civilization itself depends on their success. The genetic lineage you helped preserve through careful seed selection lives on in ways you could never have imagined. The varieties of wheat, barley and oats that survived in peasant gardens through the darkest periods of medieval history became the foundation for the agricultural revolution that followed. Modern plant breeders, working in laboratories with equipment you couldn't have conceived, still rely on the genetic diversity that farmers like you maintained through generations of careful cultivation and selection. Your descendants, if they could be traced through the tangled genealogies of European history, likely escaped the agricultural bondage that defined your existence. Some may have become merchants, scholars, or craftsmen. Others might have emigrated to distant continents, carrying with them the deeply ingrained work ethic and resilience that your example helped to instill. A few may have risen to positions of wealth and influence that would have been impossible to imagine from the perspective of your muddy fields. But they all carry something of you within them, not just genetic material, but the accumulated wisdom of survival that your life represented. The ability to endure hardship without losing hope, to find meaning in simple tasks, to maintain human connections despite crushing circumstances. These qualities, forged in the furnace of medieval peasant life, became part of the cultural inheritance that shaped entire populations. The university that now sits on land once owned by Lord Aldrich houses scholars who study the very period you lived through, trying to understand the experiences of people like you through fragmentary records and archaeological evidence. They write papers about medieval agriculture, feudalism, and peasant life, analysing the economic and social systems that shaped your world. But for all their learning, they can only approximate the lived reality of what it meant to stake your family's survival on the behaviour of weather, soil, and crops. In the museum nearby, behind glass cases and carefully controlled lighting, artefacts from your era tell sanitised stories about medieval life. A wooden plough, similar to the one you use, sits on display, labelled as an example of primitive farming technology. Visitors walk past it quickly, more interested in the swords and armour that represent the dramatic aspects of medieval history. They don't linger to contemplate the millions of hands that gripped similar handles, the countless backs that bent to guide such implements through resistant earth. The church where Father Benedict once preached about the virtue of suffering still stands, though greatly altered by centuries of renovation and restoration. Tourists now visit to admire its architecture and photograph its ancient stones, unaware that those stones were quarried and placed by men whose lives resembled yours more than they resembled anything these modern visitors have experienced. The graves in the churchyard have been disturbed and rearranged so many times that whatever marker once indicated your resting place has long since vanished. Yet, in some strange way, your influence has grown stronger rather than weaker with the passage of time. Every person alive today who has enough to eat owes their survival, in part, to the accumulated agricultural knowledge that people like you preserved and passed down. The techniques you developed for soil management, crop rotation, and animal husbandry became the foundation for agricultural practices that now feed billions rather than hundreds. The environmental challenges that modern farmers face, soil depletion, climate change, biodiversity loss, might have been more easily solved if the intimate knowledge of local ecosystems that you possessed had been preserved and built upon rather than discarded in favour of industrial efficiency. The sustainable practices that your circumstances forced you to develop are now being rediscovered by agricultural scientists who recognise that bigger and faster aren't always better. Your story, repeated millions of times across the medieval countryside, represents one of humanity's greatest collective achievements: the gradual transformation of subsistence agriculture into surplus production that could support non-farming populations. The cities, universities, cathedrals, and kingdoms of medieval Europe were all made possible by the labour of people whose individual stories were considered too humble to record. In the end, you were part of something much larger than any individual life, a vast and multi-generational project to wrest sustenance from a reluctant earth and create the foundations for human civilization as we know it. Your suffering was real, your hardships were genuine, and your early death was a tragedy. But your contribution was essential, your legacy is permanent, and your memory lives on in every grain of wheat that waves in fields that stretch to horizons you never saw. The medieval world that shaped and constrained your existence has passed away, but the basic human qualities you exemplified — persistence, courage, love for family, willingness to sacrifice for future generations — remain as relevant today as they were 6 centuries ago. In a world that often seems to have lost its connection to the land and the cycles of nature that sustain all life, your example reminds us that human dignity can be found not in what we own or achieve, but in how we respond to the challenges that life presents. The fields around Thornwick are quiet now, worked by machines rather than human hands, but they still produce the wheat that becomes bread on tables around the world. And in that eternal cycle of planting and harvest, your spirit continues its ancient work, feeding humanity one grain at a time, one season at a time, one generation at a time. This is how civilizations are really built, not by the famous names in history books, but by countless unknown people who get up each day and do the work that needs to be done, whether anyone notices or not. You were one of those people, and the world is still a better place because you were here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.